Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Tickles Talks, the segment where we talk about whatever I feel like talking about. And we're going to talk today about race building for Dungeons & Dragons. So for this, I'm going to be using a race of my own design as an example, because it's one of the races that I'm the most comfortable with out of my own. I've gotten several compliments on it, which helps me feel a little bit more cemented in having done a fairly good job on it. So, without further ado, we're going to go into that. Step 1 is building the background and the society. That, to me, is probably the most essential part. Everything else after that goes on your character sheet comes from there somewhere. Everything that you see in the characters that people play comes from the player's handbook description of the race. That's where you find all of the functionality of it, and when you're making a race yourself, that's where you're making the functionality. Whatever the functionality is, it has to make sense with whatever the race's background is. So their society, their typical emotional setting, and their psychological well-being and frame of mind, as well as whatever general sort of culture they themselves tend to make. That's what makes all of what you do as that race and what you can do. So that's where we go into the detail about their biology, their whole world that they've made for themselves inside of the rest of whatever world they're on. This one comes from a place that I am currently working on called the Dark World. The name of it doesn't really matter. It's a world at the edge of the universe that the evil gods in Dungeons & Dragons have taken for themselves, and they're sending their races there in order to bolster their numbers and grow their power in order to make a functional army to march against the good deities. All of the different gods involved in this are also secretly plotting against each other, so that's a big part of all of it. But this race is a byproduct of that. They're not under control from any one of these gods, which was something very fun to make for all of this. So, without further ado, I introduce the Doriel. They are half Yuan-Ti and half human. Now, the humans on this dark world that I use are the same humans that come from the fallen Netherese Empire from several editions ago. The humans from the Netherese Empire, for those of you that are unfamiliar, are from an empire that was entirely based on your magical potential. It's called a magocracy. They were tied to the Shadow Weave that came from Shar, which was directly in opposition to and hidden inside of and underneath the Weave from Mystra, the source of all magic. So the Shadow Weave amplified things like necromancy and illusion, but it also weakened things like radiant magic, divine stuff. And the Doriel are a byproduct of the Yuan-Ti having to mate with these humans that are tied to the Shadowfell, which is where the Shadow Weave is kind of tied to itself, is Shar, which is from the Shadow Realm. And it's not anything to do with love, just for the people who know about the Yuan-Ti. For those that don't, the Yuan-Ti are the snake-like people, and the purebloods look mostly human with some snake-like features that canonically can only be seen by very perceptive people. And they are almost completely emotionless. Humans are a tool for them. In fact, most of the other races are. They manipulate them to further plots. In this case, on this dark world, this plot is to find out every weakness they possibly can by getting as close and intimate a look at the humans, and other races as well, as they possibly can manage. But the humans are the only ones that they are genetically compatible with. So the Doriel happen on the rare occasion that a Yuan-Ti pureblood ends up finding it necessary to breed with a human to further these plots. They name them Doriel, which in the Yuan-Ti language means unfamiliar one. They are branding them from the beginning as strangers, as unwanted. And they abandon them on the streets. The ones that raise the Doriel are usually humans, sometimes elves, but always someone who saw them on the street and decided they had a use for that child. Usually it's, I can make my own apprentice and prodigy child or progeny that is entirely designed around what I want it to be, and I can have my own tool that's completely loyal to me. Remember, this is a dark world we're talking about. And what comes from that is kind of what helps form their culture. They themselves, from this upbringing, wind up being very callous, very jaded towards the world. They are very harsh in personality, and they move almost unseen without even attempting to hide from other races. But that's because they're unwanted children that were abandoned, and they wind up ignored by most of the other races. So for the example, with the Doriel, I use the same format that we see in the player's manuals from 3rd edition on. I started playing with 3rd edition, so if they continued using this from whatever came before 3rd edition, I don't know if it was 2nd, I don't know if that would be Dungeons & Dragons Advanced. I've read a little bit of that stuff, but not enough to really be very familiar with it. But I use the format that we by now are mostly familiar with. So the first part details that they are creatures of the night. They tend to stay inside during the day, and their eyes are inherently very sensitive to sunlight. Their dark vision is perfected, in contrast to their Yuan-Ti parent, allowing for a fully functional range of vision and color, even in the darkest of light. Natural light, that is. The magic inherently present in the Yuan-Ti that gives them their poison and their dominion over serpents latches onto the Shadowfell that has corrupted the humans and sometimes elves. In this case, it's just humans. They only breed with humans. It latches onto the Shadowfell, and it twists this magic from the Yuan-Ti into a new paradigm inside of these half-breeds. Instead of mostly human-looking with some patches of serpentine-looking skin and odd eyes, they are very obviously not human. Their skin comes in very dark colors, from black to dark blue or purple, and it shimmers very slightly in the light because it reflects off of scales that are almost imperceptibly small, that make up their skin and even their pores. Their mouths have long pointed teeth and lengthy thin forked tongues like a serpent. Their eyes come in deep dark shades of purple and black, and they don't have a pupil. Their hair tends to grow stiff, and they kind of resemble spines on their heads like a porcupine almost, but much longer, until it grows underneath or below their shoulders, and then it starts to lay down more, but it will still look very thick. It comes in shades of gray, silver, and white, which comes from the creatures like the Shadarkai that we see attached to the Shadowfell. They end up with these corpse-like bodies with this dark skin and white hair, kind of like the Drow, which is what the Shadarkai really are, and we'll go into that in another video completely. Their fingers, like their parents, come to these sharp tips, but they end at the same length as any humans, and unlike the humans or the Yuan-Ti, their nails tend to grow in the same semi-conical shape as their fingertips, and they come to a natural point. Rather than having claws, it's more like they have the nail kind of encasing their fingertip, which just happens to grow in a pointed design. They are very self-sufficient creatures. They make very little noise once they learn how to procure items on their own. From that point on is when they get forgotten most of the time, even by the people raising them. They learn by watching and piecing together how to do what they need to do, and eventually they end up leaving their homes, trying to find other Doriel in an attempt to understand more about their unique biology, and it doesn't take long for them to figure out that they're the different one. The next section goes into detailing their culture, which is still budding. In this world, they've been around for roughly 200 years, and they've been popping up in the city districts as the Yuan-Ti purebloods intermingle in whatever intimate way they end up needing to with the human populace to gather information and formulate a plan should the humans and other races turn on them in spite of this law, which is a sort of corrupt law, which again, I'll go into on another video. The other kind of plots that they end up going for are how to possibly overthrow these humans. And initially, the Doriel were given their name as a race by the Yuan-Ti that abandoned them. It was written on a note on their naked body that was left in the street without so much as a blanket. It was kind of like labeling your garbage, is the way the Yuan-Ti look at it. Sometimes they were found by their genetic human parents, but most often it was by a wandering human or Shadar Kai that didn't have it in them to leave the baby, or more frequently saw the potential usefulness to a protege that they raised and tailored the behavior of. By the time we get to this dark world, the Yuan-Ti have been approached by several of the Doriel with questions, and spared no time in telling them the heritage of their nature, just so that they could dig at them about their classification as trash among the Yuan-Ti. When it was discovered by the Doriel, many of them began searching tomes and asking questions of their ancestors, and when it came to light that Draconic served as the basis for their language before it was forgotten, the Doriel found the ancient Draconic scripts and made them their own, and began to form a culture around each other, one that they taught each other to be mistrusting of the Yuan-Ti and pitying towards humans, because, like the Yuan-Ti, they see themselves as higher, but they're not Yuan-Ti. They end up living even further in the darkness than the shade-touched humans that rescued them or raised them, and they have more hate than the Yuan-Ti, who abandoned them, and they use that hate to fuel their willingness to live. To them, life and prosperity is their truest revenge for their own abandonment, and they are shameless in their status in society above the Yuan-Ti because they're closer to human. But the Yuan-Ti still consider them lesser, and have made this known to their society by encouraging and managing to brand them as Doriel, which, to the Yuan-Ti, is the same as managing to label them as trash. Now this comes through in a lot of the names that they choose. Several of the names are things where they will choose Black, or Fang, or Claw, and others are more spiteful names, where they kind of take an attitude like, oh, if I'm trash, I'm going to call myself that, and the Draconic word for trash, or garbage, is what they take as their name. The way that this all functions towards kind of making their own personal culture is as they begin to breed together and make more Doriel. They teach them, do not trust the Yuan-Ti, pity the humans because they're weaker than us. And they continue this trend. The next section details how their snake blood became infested with the Shadowfell. They were born of the Yuan-Ti and the humans from this world, and the Shadowfell mingled with the snake blood and caused different reactions and traits than are seen in either one. Their bodies took on this dark appearance with these tiny snake scales, and the magic from the snake blood that was more attuned towards poison became more attuned towards darkness and death, as the Shadowfell does to everything it touches. They don't have the poison immunity that Yuan-Ti do, but they do find themselves drawn to the death and shadows, and that's where their features come in. The few Doriel that managed to find themselves adopted by Shadar Kai learned how to tap into the Shadowfell abilities by their Shadar Kai parents, and then they spread this instruction to the others, so by now, all of them know how to tap into these different features and sort of gifts from the Shadowfell. And this is what I mean about going into detail about their culture, not just like what it is, but also how it formed into what it is. Really give it that meat, that grit. Find a way to look at all of the avenues that would have an influence and where they would go from different angles. You're creative enough to be making a race as it is. The simple fact that you want to make one means that you can. I promise you that. So this is definitely something you can do. I personally have a lot of fun making it, and you very much will too, I have no doubt of that, if you do it right. If you make one of the races that we see out there that is so unbelievably common, I can't count how many I've seen, where they try to make a race inspired by a particular element or golems or something like that, and they break the game if you're playing that race by giving you from level 1, just for being this race, total immunity to all physical damage that's non-magical. Well, that's touching on legendary status there. You don't see that in the NPCs even until they reach that point at which you are almost fighting a demigod. And you can't start with that, because that kind of damage is kind of where most campaigns start. There is magic, of course, it's Dungeons & Dragons, but you're going to be mostly facing physical damage unless you're in a high fantasy campaign, like extremely high fantasy. Magic-centered, even. So that's just not something viable. Or we even see others where they focus so hard on not breaking the game by making it overpowered that they wind up making a race that's so broken and weak, you can't do anything if you play as it. The whole thing is just negative after negative after negative. So if before you think about positives and negatives, you take a keen eye as close as you can to the culture, what formed it, how that influenced it, where these creatures took it based on where they came from and what they were raised as, and which things stuck around versus which things faded away, and which things faded but still left a lasting mark, you will find yourself able to make a balanced race. So with that, I'll move on to the features here. You'll see from everything that's just been shown, there is everything in there in the features. What we have for the alignment set is conflicting emotions and an internal fight of their own soul. Their treatment by and hatred for the Yuan-Ti pushes them away from the evil that they see the Yuan-Ti going close to. But society at large in this dark world houses very few examples of good, so they wind up being more neutral, but they can't escape the chaos in them from this massive conflict. And part of the biology mix here, Yuan-Ti already age and mature at the same rate as humans, so do the Doriel. Thinking logically there is no reason why somehow the Shadowfell corrupting the magic within the Yuan-Ti and their half-breed children would somehow make them live longer. It doesn't do that to the humans, it certainly isn't going to do that to their offspring. But then we have the true dark vision. In absolute non-magical darkness, they will see without issue, including discerning individual colors, shapes, and contours. But there is always going to be a drawback to that. Their eyes are extremely sensitive to light, so when they're in daylight, they have disadvantage on their attack rolls and all of their perception checks that rely on sight. That's part of their whole infested by this darkness. They're not able to really see properly in the light because it's so blinding to them. Light is too much. And we see with the Yuan-Ti they have innate spellcasting, so I kept that with this, but I twisted everything. I found certain things that allow the same sort of mood, but translated over to death and darkness. They start off with the Toll the Dead cantrip. And like the Suggestion cantrip towards snakes that the Yuan-Ti get, the Doriel can cast Temptation an unlimited number of times just like the Yuan-Ti can. But the Yuan-Ti can do that with snakes. Doriel can only target undead creatures, and then we have to look at balance again, because if you just leave it there, technically you could do that to any vampire or lich even. That's not okay. But if we balance that, they can only target undead creatures with an intelligence equal to or under half of their level. So at level 2 is when that starts to actually become useful. Level 1, it's just not, because everything that attacks has an intelligence of at least 1. So they're not able to do that yet, which is very good for all of this. It means that starting out they only get Toll to Dead, which does damage. And it's also the only one of the 3 spells in this innate spellcasting that does damage. Once they hit 2nd level, this can become useful if the undead creature has an intelligence of 1 only. And then once they hit 3rd level, they can cast Darkness, but they can't cast it again until after they finish a long rest. So it's not going to be, okay, I did it 10 seconds ago, so here's Darkness again. But at the same time, it can play a very good strategic role. It's not something damaging, it's not something that's going to break the game, but it can come in handy. Kind of like with the Dark Elves and their Fairy Fire trait. After that, we have a trait that I called Shadeborn. And we see this with the Minotaur race, if you allow that. Their race is counted as monstrous, I believe it was, when they're calculating damage and effects. So I kind of took a bit of a tone from that, with the understanding that the Doriel have been infested with the Shadowfell, which, as we see from the Shadar Kai, it gives them this sort of undead body. So while their creature type is humanoid, when they're being affected by spells and attacks, they're considered undead. Effects that cause necrotic damage will heal them for half of the intended damage instead of harming them. However, healing magic will damage them for half of the hit points that were supposed to be restored. And the last feature is Fellblood, which is the Shadowfell in their veins. Because of this, they can feel the shadows and what dwells inside of them, so they have dexterity saving throws they can make against sneak attacks, so there's a little bit of balance there as well. They don't immediately know that something is there, it depends on how they roll. Sometimes they're not paying enough attention to know something's about to sneak up on them and attack them. Sometimes it's kind of like Spider-Man's spider sense, so they kind of get this feeling like, oh, something's about to stab me, and then they can move. But it's not something that's going to come into effect every single time. The DM just has to remember, have them roll a dexterity saving throw, and if they fail, they didn't know that the creature attacking them was there. And it doesn't apply to attacks of opportunity, just sneak attacks. So, all of that together is my big example. They're medium-sized creatures, they have a 30-foot speed, because Yuan-Ti and humans are both medium-sized creatures with 30-foot speed. There's no reason to think that this half-breed is going to have something different than both of its parents in that respect. Their ability score increase is 1 to dexterity and 2 to constitution, because of the whole reflexes from the snake side and constitution from being more hardy in the way that they were raised. And that's where that comes from. They had to adapt, they had to become hardy, because they're on this dark world where the world itself is trying to kill them. They've been forgotten about by pretty much even their own parents, and they have to fend for themselves. So they get to be much more self-reliant, much more hardy, much more jaded, harsh, much more cynical, callous. All of that is my process for building a race. You build the race itself first. You start off with the concept, you let that grow from there, and then you think about the world you've put it in and how that world is going to treat it, and what that does to influence its society. Then you think about what that society is going to do to try to overcome its own difficulties and even shortcomings. And then you try to figure out where to go from that. You build the whole culture, the psychology behind the race, you build everything but the actual stats that go on your page. And then once you have all of that to a place that you're happy with, that you feel confident in, you look at that and you find out what makes sense. And after you find what makes sense, you find what looks overpowered and you find a way to water it down enough that it still makes as much sense as it should with the background of the whole race, without being game-breaking, so that people can have fun with it. They can have fun with a party member playing as this, or a party member on the DM's side, where they don't have to worry about, if I do this, are they going to have some secret trick up their sleeve that just pulls it out of everything and ruins the whole gameplay and plan for everyone. But it also doesn't wind up being weak, so they're not going to be some tiny little crumbly squishy race that ruins being whatever class you decide to choose. That's my guide on making a race. If you have any other pointers, please feel free to point them out in the comments, because if people are here, they are absolutely looking for pointers on all of this, and I guarantee my one process isn't going to work for everyone. Maybe you have something that works even better. Get a conversation going. If you liked this, go ahead and click the thumbs up button. If you don't, fine, feel free to let me know. Tell me what I can do better next time. I am always open for constructive criticism. Make sure to subscribe if you want to hear more. Take a look at my other videos. I do some readings on Lovecraft stories that I need to get back into. I have another video, probably a couple more by the time some people hear this, that are also on Dungeons & Dragons and other Tickles Talks subjects. Until next time, make sure to have fun, have a great time with whatever you're gonna do, and if you're building a race, make it one you can be proud of, and just enjoy the ride. Till next time, I'm Tickles. Have a good night. Bye.